Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to say thanks very much for turning up. It's all very good of you, especially those who've come from a long way away. I'd like to thank John for his very generous introduction. If only it were true. He mentioned a hunger for insights, and I have to say that my hunger for insights often takes me to John's door. John is a fantastic polymath, whereas I'm lucky to be a math. I'd like to thank Stephen Overy, who's lurking at the back, for his highly efficient and courteous and good-humoured way of arranging this evening and all the other Temenos events. So thank you, Stephen, for that. I'm going to just say a few words on poetry, imagination, inspiration, and the Muse. And it's really a sketch of a thread of ideas that's been engaging me recently. The talk comes in at around 45 to 50 minutes, so it's not the longest. And if there's time for questions afterwards, then please feel free to ask them. So, drinking at the fountains. I've taken the title of my talk from a quote by the travel writer Patrick Leigh Fermor in connection with a story he used to tell about a poem by Horace, and it's a handy way of entering my theme. During the Second World War, Patrick Leigh Fermor was a British commando on the German-occupied island of Crete, and with the help of local Cretans and his colleagues, he successfully kidnapped the German general Heinrich Kreiper. As they fled across the mountains of Crete with Germans in hot pursuit, there came a moment one early morning when the sun was breaking over the top of Mount Ida. And Leigh Fermor noticed Kreiper murmuring to himself and heard the words, "Vide ut alta stet nive candidum soracti." And Leigh Fermor recognized the words, as Horace's Ode, Book 1, Number 9, a poem that he happened to know off by heart. And as Kreiper's words tailed off, Leigh Fermor continued the poem in Latin, all 24 lines of them, right to the end. As Leigh Fermor later wrote, "The general's blue eyes had swiveled away from the mountain top to mine, and when I'd finished, after a long silence, he said, 'Ach, so Hermeja.' It was very strange, as though for a long moment the war had ceased to exist. We had both drunk at the same fountains long before, and things were different between us for the rest of our time together." Drinking at the fountains. In one way, Leigh Fermor was merely saying that he and Kreiper enjoyed the same sort of classical education that enabled them both to appreciate Horace's Ode. But he was also acknowledging that the power of imagination is blind to nationality, conflict, time, and so on. And in choosing that image, drinking at the fountains, he was also conflating poetry with water, inspiration with the idea of water bubbling up from a source. The word fountain, of course, comes from the Latin fons, hence a font, and means not only a spring or fountain, but also a source or origin. In Greco-Roman culture, to drink from particular springs was to imbibe the source of language, i.e., poetic inspiration. On Mount Helicon in central Greece, there were two springs that gave inspiration. One of them was called the Hippocrene, which literally means horse spring. Why? Because it was said that the winged horse Pegasus struck his hoof on a rock on Helicon with such impact that a spring burst out of it. So, when Keats says that he yearns for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene, he's marrying the image of inspirational water, Hippocrene, with the colour of wine, blushful. Mount Helicon was, of course, the home of the 9 Muses, who were assigned to different arts, ranging from music to history to poetry. And this Western tradition of the Muse as a divine source of poetry goes back 3,000 years at least. When Homer starts the Odyssey, he says, "Andromi enepe musa polytropon." Tell me, O Muse, of the man of many schemes. At the start of the Aeneid, Virgil says, "Musa mihi causas memora." O Muse, tell me about the causes. Fast forward to Dante, who in the Inferno says, "O Muses, O high genius, now give me your help." In Paradise Lost, Milton also invokes the Muse, but being a good patriarchal Puritan, he changes the female divinity to the Holy Spirit. For the Romantic poets, the Muse was still cited as a potent source of creation. Keats promises the goddess Psyche that he will be her priest and build a temple, quote, "in some untrodden region of my mind." Wordsworth associates the Muse with the mind's, quote, "internal heaven, which sheds her dews of inspiration on the humblest poem." The phrase internal heaven and Keats's untrodden region of the mind both suggest the Muse being drawn away from her mountaintop and relocated to the human psyche, a place more manageable and more Freudian. Coleridge too seems to follow this trend, claiming that the Muse enabled him to commune with my heart, i.e., it was a conduit to his innermost feelings. The Muse is becoming psychologically internalized. Perhaps as the Muse became less transcendent, less remote, it lost its divine luster and left it vulnerable to the cold winds of skepticism. Even by the 1st century AD, there were the likes of the Roman poet Persius, who gently mocked the idea of inspiration and the story of Pegasus and the Hippocrene spring, which he called Fonte Caballino, the spring of the old nag. But it wasn't until the dawn of modernism that the Muse truly became a shadow of her former self. William Morris was disparaging about the idea of inspiration and exalted craftsmanship instead, a radical shift from Plato's assertion that all good poets compose their beautiful poems not by art, but because they are inspired and possessed. T.S. Eliot referred to the Muse as, quote, a hackneyed metaphor. A hackneyed metaphor, even though in Ash Wednesday he addresses a Muse-like figure with an invocation as solemn as Homer's, Virgil's, or Milton's. Blessed sister, holy mother, spirit of the fountain, spirit of the garden, suffer us not to mock ourselves with falsehood. Teach us to care and not to care. The Muse is still bandied around by contemporary poets, but seldom with conviction. In fact, it arguably has less potency than its polar opposite, the demon that goes by the name of writer's block. Nevertheless, the Muse has been and is associated with poetry that bears the mark of inspiration. The magic image, phrase, line, or poem that seems to the poet to come out of nowhere and which exerts a perennial fascination on its readers. I've often wondered when poetry bearing the mark of the Muse first began, in history or prehistory. When did it first appear? Did the Lascaux cave painters, for example, 17,000 years ago, draw a distinction between everyday speech and a way of communication that might be considered poetic? As George Steiner said, we have no idea exactly when for the first time someone in ancient Greece saw the ocean was wine dark. Nor do we know when in ancient Palestine someone first perceived the morning stars all singing together, as the author of the book of Job wrote. My guess is that the articulation of imaginative thinking began at the dawn of human consciousness, that people have always had the ability to compare two things in a way that makes either of them magical. For example, the Yakut people of eastern Siberia, whose oral shamanic traditions go back as far as anyone can remember, picture the night sky as the dark interior of a gigantic tent, a cosmic version of one of their own nomadic tents. And in the same way that their tents have a seam at the top, the cosmic tent has the Milky Way. In a similar vein, the stars are holes in the cosmic tent, letting in the light. And if the gods should open up the cosmic tent to peek at the earth, the streaks of light they let in are meteors. In a related sort of way, I remember my daughter, as a 3-year-old, looking at a black and white Frisian cow and saying, "Daddy, that cow has clouds on it." Suddenly the cow, and indeed the clouds, became enriched. Such observations show the imagination, in Shelley's phrase, respecting the similitude of things, and give the deep pleasure of connectedness. Historians of language say that poetry actually preceded prose, because it's the language of memory. With its distinctive rhythms, repetitions, images, and other verbal devices, poetry was used to memorize rituals and other traditional lore. But it's hard to know how extensive and universal poetry or verse was in prehistoric oral cultures. We do know that our prehistoric ancestors practiced other art forms. Painting, for example, and music, as demonstrated by a 40,000-year-old flute made from the wing bone of a vulture found in a cave in southern Germany. I have to say that the notion of a dying vulture being circled by people is a very strange, surreal role reversal. To play an instrument is to naturally elicit bodily movements, even if it's only the tapping of a foot or a finger. So the likelihood of dance at this period is high. Painting, music, dance, we can be pretty sure, were staples of prehistoric societies. And if there's speech and music, the chances are there will be song or chant or incantation for rituals such as invoking rain, commemorating the dead, or just a good old sing-song. With many due caveats observed, we might get an inkling into our prehistoric ancestors' songmaking and therefore verse-making from contemporary indigenous peoples, such as the Australian Aboriginal communities, whose traditions go back 10,000s of years. Fundamental to the latter are the so-called songlines, made famous by Bruce Chatwin, a sort of highly rhythmic chanted poetry, or cousin of poetry, rapidly delivered, concentrated speech, imbued, as it were, with sonic vibrations. The actual lines of the word songlines refer to tracks across a landscape, said to be created by totemic animal ancestors, such as emu or dingo. The journeys they took and what they did on them, whether it was building a campfire or having a battle, explains the creation of topographical features such as a waterhole, mountain, anthill, or rock. And the lines have a practical purpose too. They are like prehistoric Google Maps, marking boundaries of different tribal areas and providing signposts for crossing the desert. Those are the lines of the songlines. The songs of the songlines celebrate and act out these ancestral journeys. And what's interesting from the point of view of a modern poet is that the chanted songlines do not recall past events so much as make listeners feel as if they're actually participating in the narrative. So it's the difference between hearing about the retreat from Dunkirk in a classroom from a teacher and actually playing the part of a soldier in a historical reenactment. To enchant an audience so that it feels itself part of the story must be the aim of all poets and artists. In a songline of the Yanyuwa people of northern Australia, for example, the words tell of the journey of the ancestor spirit dingo. Part of it goes like this. Footprints of the dingo in the sand as he crosses the sand ridge country. Gravel lines the bed of the Fletcher Creek. Dingo walks over the gravel in the dry Fletcher Creek. He climbs the bank. Dingo smells the wind of the plains country as he travels. Even in translation, you can sense poetry in the rhythm and the repetition of images, both crucial to the act of memorization. In the Yanyuwa language itself, the above quote starts like this: Burundal, Burundalaya, Danwengangi, Windijingani. But it's the singing that activates the words into their fullness of being. The subtle risings and fallings of the melody mimic the progress of dingo in a way that the speaking voice cannot match. So the words I've just spoken would sound more like this, according to my YouTube research. Burundal, Burundalaya, Dawengangi, Windijingani, etc. This might give modern poets food for thought, that the element of sonic resonance, with its vitalizing vibrations, gives words a musicality that transforms them. Our first poetry, then, perhaps comprised words transformed by musical sounds and concerned with everyday life. We need rain, we want the crops to grow, but it was addressed to denizens of another dimension. Gods, spirits, totemic ancestors. And to facilitate communication with the other world, there were specialists whom we now lump together under the name of shaman or shaman, a figure who included the roles of prophet, healer, priest, psychopomp, and perhaps the nearest equivalent to what we might call a poet. The shaman was an intermediary between different realms of reality, someone who could fly to the upper world or the underworld to converse with spirits and then return to reveal the knowledge he or she had gained to members of the community. So perhaps the otherworldly adventures and wisdom that the shaman recounted became the stuff of our first poetry. I imagine the shaman to be like a songline's reciter, making his listeners feel they are part of his poetic story, for which you don't need metaphor. Invocations to the gods about crops or rainfall or for mourning the dead, and the stories of the songlines do not require brilliant imagery. But they do require the honesty and fidelity to truth of all great poetry. So it's my guess that in prehistory, two streams of poetic utterance emerged. One shaped by necessity, bearing the urgency of prayer and marked by rhythm and repetitions and simple language. And the other born of nature, involving the magic of imagination and the gift of metaphor. And at certain times and in certain cultures there came cross-fertilizations between the two streams, as in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was written down about 4,000 years ago and has the repetitions and strong, clear narrative of a songline. But it also has what might be the first written example of poetic imagination. To take one example, during the story, the hero Gilgamesh is shaken to the core by the death of his soulmate, Enkidu. For 6 days I wept for him, and 7 nights. he says, his words barely evoking the chill of death and the emotional toll of grief. But then comes a detail that changes everything. I did not surrender his body for burial, Gilgamesh says, until a maggot dropped from his nostril. Until a maggot dropped from his nostril. The creator or creators of the poem could have said, until the corpse began to putrefy or smell a bit. But the image of a maggot, small and white, exiting the dark cave of a nostril, a living thing emerging from dead flesh, lodges in the mind. It is redolent of the poetic imagination. The first glimmerings of poetic imagery in Gilgamesh shine brightly in Homer. In the Iliad and Odyssey, written down about 2,700 years ago, the Homeric simile makes a triumphant appearance. For example, towards the end of the Odyssey, Telemachus is tasked to hang 12 disloyal palace maids. So Homer says that Telemachus fixes up a sort of washing line just high enough for the maids' feet not to touch the ground. It's all very gruesome. And then he says, quote, as when long-winged thrushes or doves fall into a snare that is set in a thicket as they seek to reach their resting place, and hateful is the bed that gives them welcome. Even so, the women held their heads in a row, and round the necks of all nooses were laid, that they might die most piteously. And they writhed a little while with their feet, but not long. It's gruesomely matter of fact, but related with painterly detail. The image of the birds heightens the sense of vulnerability, twitchiness, and pallor of the women. Homer's similes show a new level of imaginative consciousness. They are not brief asides, trinkets to adorn the body of the verse, but more like tattoos imprinted on its skin. Sometimes they can take over the surface action. For example, in a famous scene in the Iliad, Homer says that the Greek hero Diomedes squares up to fight the Trojan warrior Glaucus. Diomedes is worried. He thinks Glaucus might be a god, which would mean certain death. So, during the heat of battle, he asks him who he is. Glaucus responds by asking Diomedes why he should be so bothered about his ancestry. Then he carries on with these haunting 4 lines. Oi per philon yenei, toi ide ke andron, philatamen Temenos hamades hei, ala the thili teletha oso fii. Earos the piigneteori, os andron yenei, I men fii, I the poligi. People's lives are like the generations of leaves. The wind scatters the old leaves across the earth. The trees burst alive with new buds, and spring returns. That's how it is with human beings. As one generation comes to life, another dies away. Homeric and other epic poetry revels in metaphor and imagery, but what it couldn't do so well was express the writer's own personal feelings and thoughts, which became the preserve of lyric verse. Short poems in set metrical forms, usually accompanied by a lyre, hence the name, but not always. With lyric poetry, there's a shift in poetic imagination. Instead of the set-piece grandeur of epic, we find a more quiet, pensive, confessional voice, and we can sense a more intimate connection between poet and muse. When exactly the lyric form emerged is hard to say. It's not a seamless transfer from epic to lyric. Epic has moments of lyric, and lyric has a mythic content not out of place in epic. But the first major exponents of the lyric form in the West were the Greek poets Archilochus, Alcaeus, and Sappho, writing at the end of the 7th century BC. Sappho herself apparently ran a school, or finishing school, for women, teaching them music and letters, and her poems sing of love and loss and other matters of the heart and mind. They've come down to us mostly as tantalizing fragments. Nevertheless, you can feel a more personal voice even in single lines, such as, "Face me, my dear one, and unveil the grace in your eyes." Or, "I loved you, Athis, once, long ago." Or, "I would rather gaze on the lovely way Anactoria walks in the glow of her face than all the chariots and troops of the Lydians." The direct voice of the poet or the poet's persona and a more feeling-based imagination seems like a wine-dark sea away from the authors of the epics and the songlines. The lyric mode was passed down and refined by Roman poets such as Catullus and Horace. Horace pays due reverence to the Muse, as you would expect, but he also shows signs that he wants to ascribe his poetic gifts not to the Muse, but to himself. For example, in his Odes Book 3, number 13, he addresses a fountain or spring known as Bandusia, and reverses the traditional idea that sacred water inspires and gives fame to a poet. The ode goes like this: "O Bandusian spring, outshining glass, worthy of sweet wine and flowers, tomorrow you'll receive a young goat, its horns just bulging from its brow, and primed for lustiness and fighting in vain. This scion of a frisky ram will dye your freezing flow of water with a hot, red, bloody stream. The torrid season of the dog-star does not affect the kindly way you cool the wandering herds and bulls exhausted from the plough. I will bring you fame, yes, you, by singing of the oak tree on the cave from which your chattering waters cascade." Here, Horace is confident enough in his poetic talent to suggest it is he who will confer fame on the spring, not vice versa. The sacrificial kid will be a futile offering, unlike Horace's own sacrificial offering, i.e. a poem, no less, whose flow of lines is more potent than the flow of blood from a dead animal. Even as Horace was turning out elegant lyric poems on his Sabine farm, working out his relationship with the Muse, there still existed in Greco-Roman world a reminder of the time when Greek poetry was perhaps closely connected to prehistoric shamanism and the roots of poetry, as the myth of Orpheus and his journey to the underworld may suggest. This was the Delphic Oracle, which centered on a priestess known as the Pythia. The Pythia would go into a trance and receive inspiration directly from Apollo. She was the mouthpiece of the god, and the words she spoke were in a language no one could understand except a trained priest, who would translate the apparent gibberish into verse forms that were often riddling and appealed to the imagination, not reason. It was as if to understand the words of the gods, you had to listen like a poet, not like a politician. For example, when Xerxes of Persia was invading Greece with a huge army, the Athenians got panicky and rushed off to consult the Delphic Oracle, twice in fact. And on the second time, the oracle said, "Put faith in a wooden wall," and then added ominously, "O divine Salamis, you will destroy the sons of women." So with the ears of a politician, the wooden wall would seem quite straightforward, a palisade put around the city of Athens to protect it from the Persians. But it was interpreted to mean the wooden walls of ships, i.e. the Athenian navy. And that's what the Athenians did. They invested in their navy. And the mention of destruction at Salamis was, as we know in retrospect, referring to the death of the Persians, not the Athenians. The oracle could have been less ambiguous. It could have said in bureaucratic prose, "Build ships. Trust your navy. You'll win a victory at Salamis." But it followed the ancient tradition that the language of the gods is mythic, poetic, and elliptic, and uses riddling phrases. We're making good time on the talk, in case you're flagging. We're at over 2/3 at least. The Delphic Oracle staggered on until the late 4th century AD, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius I closed it down. But the riddle as a poetic form continued, notably in the Old English or Anglo-Saxon tradition. The Anglo-Saxon imagination, as many of you will know, is known for its poetic phrases known as kennings. Word pictures that transform the way we see well-known objects. For example, the sea was known as the whale's way. A ship was an ocean steed. The sun was the sky candle. And the kenning, which says the sleep of the sword, was death. So it was a short hop from formulating kennings to riddle poems, such as this one from the Exeter Book, number 51, which sounds very approximately like this in the original. It's quite short. Ich ser radlicha wuchta feor, samad sidian swalte waran lastas. Swadu swede blacku, swift was on fore, Fåglum framra, flög on lufta, derf under utha, drög und stilla, vinenda wiga, sig himwagas takneth, over fatted gold, feor ealu. I saw 4 creatures. Curious they were, moving as one, and making dark tracks, prints of pure black. Its progress was swift. Faster than birds it flew through the air, dived under water. The tenacious warrior, working unceasingly, showed all 4 of them the way they must go across gleaming gold. Here and elsewhere, the riddle is like a metaphor for how the imagination itself works. It throws up glimpses of images and thoughts, teasing us, changing focus and perspective. What could these 4 creatures be? 4 creatures but described as a single unit. How can it move faster than birds and also dive underwater? Who is the tenacious warrior who guides it? The riddle teases our rational minds until we realize we can't work it out through logic alone. If we're lucky, we have a eureka moment. And that's the way the imagination works. The actual answer to the riddle, and I don't know if anyone had a eureka moment. Anyone care to guess what it was? Or don't be shy. One or two of you might actually know the riddle. Do you know it, John? No. It's difficult to guess if you don't know it. If you know it, it's easier to guess. No, when you know the answer, you think, oh yeah, of course.
Could you read it again?
I could. I'll do it in modern English. I saw 4 creatures. Curious they were, moving as one, and making dark tracks, prints of pure black. Its progress was swift. Faster than birds, it flew through the air, dived under water. The tenacious warrior, working unceasingly, showed all 4 of them the way they must go, across gleaming gold.
Are they clouds?
Not clouds, no, but I know where you're coming from. It's a good guess.
The elements.
Sorry?
The 4 elements.
4 elements? No, sadly.
The light.
I know why you said that. The Dark Prince. Yeah, no, it's a good guess, but it's not that.
I wondered if it might be a horse.
A horse. No, it's not a horse, but yeah, there's 4 legs and a single unit. It's a good guess. I mean, they're fiendish, these Anglo-Saxon riddles. I studied them for a while. I was poet in residence at Exeter Cathedral, where the book is actually kept. So it became a kind of a big thing in my life for about 6 months. How sad is that?
With Phaeton and his chariot with 4 horses.
That would be very Old English, actually, in its ideas, but no. I'll give you, this is a visual clue. How many fingers are holding the pen? 3. 3 fingers. The answer is 3 fingers and a quill. And I'll unpick it for you. So it's 4 things: 3 fingers and a quill, which is 1 unit. Yeah. So they move as one, and they make dark tracks, prints of pure black. It moves through the air faster than birds, dives under the water of ink. The tenacious warrior is the aching arm that guides it across gleaming gold, which is a manuscript with gold leaf on it. It's a rather beautiful riddle, actually, even when you know the answer. And that's the mark of a successful riddle poem, that even when you know the answer, it still works as a poem. If you don't know Old English riddles, do seek them out. There are about 90 odd of them. So riddles are about seeing the ordinary with a particular type of vision. And if nothing else, suggesting a way to tell the truth, but telling it slant, to use a phrase of Emily Dickinson's, herself a brilliant creator of the gnomic and riddling verse. Her slantwise vision puts the imagination at the fore. The objects of poetry are less significant than the way in which we see them. We can write about, say, a thistle or a shoelace and illuminate their inner reality if, and it's a big if, we can see into the essence of things. William Blake referred to this ability as double vision, i.e., seeing 2 things at once in a single object. He gives an example of double vision in a poem in which he describes a thistle in terms of a grey-haired old man. It's as if Blake saw through the outward surface of the thistle's whiskery spikes, its drooping head and thin body, and his imagination reshaped it into an old man. What he actually wrote is this: double the vision my eyes do see, and a double vision is always with me. With my inward eye 'tis an old man grey, with my outward a thistle across my way. For Blake, double vision was not just what poets should practice, but everybody. His fear and rage against the single vision, as he called it, of the Newtonians, of scientific reductionism and literalism, feels like a fight to the death. Pray God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep, he says. Poets naturally adopt double vision to some degree in metaphorical thinking. Take the Japanese poet Matsuo Basho, for example. During a long walking journey across Japan, he was given a pair of straw sandals with blue laces. Later on, he decided to write a haiku about these sandals. It goes like this. It looks as if iris flowers had bloomed on my feet, sandals laced in blue. Outwardly, Basho looks at the blue laces. Inwardly, he sees iris flowers with all their delicacy and promise of vitality. Basho famously said that to write a poem about something, you have to plunge into the object deep enough to see something like a hidden glimmering. For Blake, the hidden glimmering in the thistle was a frowning old man. For Basho, the hidden glimmering in a pair of blue laces was an iris. Nowadays, poets tend to view the imagination as a personal possession, subject to the will, rather than something greater than themselves, the realm of the Muse. Perhaps the days of channeled inspiration were numbered with the closing down of the Delphic Oracle. One of its last reputed utterances was, "Apollo no longer resides in his house. Gone is his prophetic laurel. Gone the speech-inspiring fountain. The speaking water has been silenced." But the speaking water, a divine source of inspiration, was never quite silenced. Lee Fermor and Kuyper, for example, among many others, subsequently drank from it. And the image of a priestess possessed by a spiritual being and spouting words that would be shaped into verse by a poet priest could perfectly well describe Mrs. Georgie Yates, a spiritualist who transmitted image-rich material from her trances for the benefit of her husband. W.B. Yeats is important for many things, not least his pronouncement that our personal memories are, quote, part of one great memory, the memory of nature herself, and that this great mind and great memory can be evoked by symbols. Yeats's Anima Mundi is cognate with Plato's realm of ideas, Jung's collective unconscious, and Ted Hughes's elemental power circuit of the universe. And it's where poets can go for inspiration, but only in a state of humility, faith, and patience, and with the help of a guide, namely the Muse. Poets all too often prefer to sit in their own private baths, turning on the tap of the will and writing about the bath water, instead of making themselves into potholes that receive rain fresh from heaven, for which they have to wait. We live in an age of the ego refusing to go gently into the night, desperate to leave traces of itself through the likes of social media, the graffiti of the virtual world. Meanwhile, the speaking waters of Delphi trickle on in the gutters of scientism, literalism, and materialism. It could be a depressing state of affairs except for the fact that it gives poets and other artists, and indeed anyone who values the imagination, a real raison d'être. Quite apart from writing poems, poets, by refusing to accept mental and emotional limitations, can remind those around them, especially cultic followers of single vision, that, to quote Louis MacNeice, world is suddener than we fancy it. World is crazier and more of it than we think. To remind anyone who cares to listen that a thistle is not only a thistle, and shoelaces are not just laces, or traffic lights just traffic lights. In Melbourne recently, I and a couple of others were being driven in a car by a woman named Penelope Buckley, a writer, critic, and widow of the Australian poet Vincent Buckley. And at the traffic lights, she suddenly said, "I love traffic lights. The colours are just beautiful. I hope they never change those colours. Look at the richness of that red." For me, as an impatient driver, traffic lights have always represented irritation or anxiety. Now I find in them a moment to pause and savour colours not found elsewhere in nature. We started with a profound poetic moment between Leigh Fermor and Kuyper, and we moved swiftly through songlines, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Homer, the Iliad, Sappho, Horace, the Delphic Oracle, Anglo-Saxon riddles, William Blake and Basho, and Yeats's Animal Mundi, and we ended with traffic lights in Melbourne. The poetic moment, the maggot in the nostril, the iris shoelaces, or any other leap into double vision or slantwise perception that shifts our perspective and opens up the mind, is available to all of us to receive or to deliver, whether we are Lascaux painters, shamans, epic poets, lyric poets, or anyone devoted to the imagination. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.